Thank you. I'm excited for this conversation. As a reminder, you have cards on your seat. Feel free to pass them to the front and to Cecily, and we'll be happy. Who's right there, and we'll be happy to get to those questions. So, sir, I want to start. I want to start here. So, since you and your family left Iran, U.S. administrations have had vastly different approaches to their Iran policy. In your opinion, which has been most effective?
In general, I would say that, and this is not limited to just U.S. foreign policy. I think it also includes the general allies of the United States in the West, in Europe, and elsewhere, that the biggest flaw in their thinking in terms of how to deal with the Islamic regime in all these years was based on a false expectation of behavior change. If you look at all the policies that various governments have implemented, whether it is by imposing more sanctions or attempting appeasement as a method, all of this with the idea that perhaps the regime will become more reasonable and come back to the negotiation table, has generally failed, irrespective of the nature and composition of those Western governments, whether they're liberal or conservative, left or right. And again, I think part of the reason I've been arguing that approach has only permitted the regime to survive all along was because, as I said, this DNA makes it impossible to coexist with the free world as we know it. You referred in your opening remarks about the fact that there's censorship and other things of that nature. This is part of the regime's DNA, that the values that the regime professes, that when they celebrate martyrdom rather than life, makes it completely different on how we talk about liberty and freedom and what have you. So the regime's nature and behavior has been ultimately based on exporting an ideology that is in direct conflict with all the values and principles that the Western free world and democratic countries are based on, which is why it has failed. So the solution is not to say, well, can we still attempt diplomacy? It has failed. And nobody wants war and conflict. That's not the solution. Therefore, you remain with the third possible way, and that is to invest this time on the people of Iran, who are the agent of change, and not waste time any further with a regime that has proven time and again that it is untrustworthy, unreliable, untransparent, and at the end is not there to defend the rights of its citizens. On the contrary, it is pillaging our country. It is at every time only interested to support its goals of exportation of ideology at the expense of the Iranian people. So that reset I was talking about is to realize that the potential to change is not only good for a country that is striving for liberation, and many times foreign governments and Western governments have been in support of countries that finally liberated themselves from respective unwanted totalitarian or racist or dictatorships, but this time to decide of whether or not they want to stand on the side of the people of Iran as an alternative. So the shift in policy, to answer your question ultimately, is rather than wasting time on how can we get back to some kind of a deal with the regime, to simply think that the best way to approach that end is to empower the Iranian people. And that is ultimately the result of a two-pronged approach, maximum pressure on the one hand on the regime, but also a policy of maximum support. And there's a lot of ideas that we have that we can discuss, probably will be among the questions I'll be asked.
Absolutely, yeah. So, to sort of follow up on that and to flick at something you made in your remarks, can you talk a little bit about, what the Trump administration's policies have been on Iran and where you think or what you think the U.S. role should be in the region?
Ever since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps the way the world, geostrategically speaking, in the East-West divide that existed during the Cold War, and where the Middle East played into that equation, and oil as a major source of energy for Western countries, and the whole debacle of how foreign policy of those days were looking at the Middle East and how to react to it. regardless of what Beijing or Moscow were thinking as opposed to what Washington or London were thinking, and so on and so forth, perhaps looked at it more as to how do we maintain a presence there? Is it a military presence? Is it some other ways? I think the nature of the beast has changed in the sense that rather than assuming the responsibility of maintaining that stability, you should in fact encourage the kind of relationships and cooperation of those regional countries so they in fact assume that responsibility. So it doesn't have to fall back on the US to play the role of guardian of peace around the world. I think that when we looked at what happened with the idea of the Abraham Accords, which of course was quite a big change when we know the history of the modern Middle East, at least in the past 40, 50 years, well, that was, I think, a huge sign of not just something that was concocted in corridors of Western diplomacy, was the actual expectation and ask of people of the region, because they are just tired of those conflicts, and they can see the potential of positive relationship that could emanate from that. I myself have proposed that perhaps one day we can elevate the Abraham Accords to the Cyrus Accords, where Iran would be part of that, and could work with our partners in the region in absolute cooperation and a fruitful strategic partnership, whether it is with Jerusalem or Riyadh or all the other countries. And therefore, that makes the work much better and easier for, let's say, the US government looking after its national security interests, or even economic interests for that matter. Because those relationships will create elements of stability, which is good for the economy in general, and it will put an end to all those conflicts and all those rivalries. So it's no longer a policy of whether or not we should police the world, but whether or not we should cultivate and strengthen those relationships. So we have to be less involved in that process. Of course, this is all based on the premise that the vacuum is not filled by the wrong players. And that's why it's so important to recognize who are your true partners and allies in this, and who are not necessarily on that same wavelength. If that approach today is contemplated by the Trump administration, and for that matter, European governments, when we talk about the Western world, and we look at your regional partners in the region, and what kind of collective benefit we see, I see this as a win-win scenario, the only loser being the regime in Tehran. I think this will be the general shift that we need at this point. So the people in the region will understand that they no longer have to hide from fear of being victim of the next terrorist attack or missile strike or what have you, that we can make the world a much safer and better place on the basis of those fruitful relations. I, for one, can easily speak on behalf of my compatriots that that's what the Iranians want to see. They want to be part of that coalition. They want to be part of that change. They don't want to no longer be trapped behind the walls that was dressed by this axis of resistance. With Assad gone in Syria, that has made it, make Iran getting much closer to that opportunity. And I think these are the kind of elements that should be contemplated when decisions are made as to how do we formulate the foreign policy.
Do you think it's possible to get there? And maybe you can expand a little bit. You obviously, spoke directly to President Trump in your remarks there. But, where do you see the sort of like second Trump administration shift on policy toward Iran going? And does it get you toward exactly what you were just saying?
Well, I'm basing my arguments on the premise that the conclusion has been reached that the prolongation of this regime is no longer tenable, that the problem is the regime itself, and that therefore ultimately a change of regime is required. Now we all know that the word or the term regime change has gotten a very bad reputation, only because it was poorly implemented in Afghanistan and Iraq. But just because it was poorly executed doesn't make the concept the wrong one. And by the way, as I said earlier, the scenario of change in Iran has nothing to do in similarity with what happened in the Middle East ever since 9/11, what needed to be done in Afghanistan, and later on what happened in Iraq. We're talking about a different scenario. And thereby, For those who say, oh my God, America is going to be involved again in some regional conflict. We just got our troops back from the Middle East. What does that mean? Do we have to have boots on the ground again? Oh, taxpayers are going to say our money is going to be spent on some other adventure. None of that is required. Because the boots on the ground in Iran are the people of Iran on the streets, except they're fighting it totally alone. The money doesn't have to come from taxpayers' money. It could perhaps be, in a large part, the redirection of frozen assets that are the Iranian people's money itself to support that cause in the context of maximum support to the Iranian people. And there are so many ways that you can implement the policy that will be the least taxing on the US, but necessary for that change to occur. So we're not going on the basis of previous experimentation that has failed or hasn't led to the proper results. In fact, we were proposing an alternative and something different than what has been experimented with before. But it does have to be, at the end, the conclusion that our true allies are the people of Iran, and this regime stands between them and the free world. So the regime has to disappear. That's what the Iranian people are asking for. They have come to the conclusion that they can no longer attain their aspirations so long as this regime is in place. And by the way, the world needs to also understand that the regime is the root cause of all the problems that we have faced, whether it's the nuclear threat, terrorism, radicalization, regional instability. And in one shot, you are eliminating all of these problems almost simultaneously by its disappearance. And I think we are now faced with that window of opportunity that I was referring to. It's a historical opportunity to make that change happen, for the interest of the people of Iran, our regional neighbors, and I think the free world.
Over the years, you've shared different views about what a post-Islamic Republic government in Iran should look like. Currently, what is your preferred type of government in a post-Islamic Republic? Is it a democracy, a monarchy, something else? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the common denominator between the majority of Iranian secular democratic forces that are diverse in terms of what their ultimate model of governance is in their mind is based on the principle of secular democracy, which means that we have, I think, the most three elements that keeps the majority of this group together, whether they're Republicans or monarchists, whether they're on the left or on the right, as secular Democrats, is three fundamental principles: human rights, as we understand it, a secular democratic system, which means a clear separation of religion from governments, which is a prerequisite to democracy. I think we have the proof of it in so many successful democracies in the world, and the importance to Iranians of Iran's territorial integrity. I think this is the three minimum elements that is the basis of cooperation that, in fact, is part of my campaign of uniting Iranian opposition based on these principles and understanding that once this regime is gone, during a transition, it is for the people of Iran to ultimately decide what's best for them. How do we achieve that? I think that there will be an interim government that will be in charge of managing the country's affairs in that period. We will call for as soon as possible, the election of a parliamentary council, a constitutional assembly, if you will, that will be charged with the responsibility to, in fact, debate and argue about areas where we may not all have necessarily the same opinion, but a democratic process where the nation this time is fully aware of all the alternatives that could be presented to them as a recommendation of that constitutional assembly. So there's a constitutional project. It may be a revision of what we had before. It may be a totally new text. The point is we need to have a clear understanding of that. There will be opportunities to debate. As I said, this is not a behind closed door affair anymore. I like to see a C-SPAN type approach that while parliamentarians are debating issues, every Iranian can tune in and observe and watch and understand exactly what's been discussed. Why is this important? Because guess what? 45 years ago, most people didn't have a clue about what Khomeini actually would be like. And I think if you look back to your years, and this I hear from many people who were participants in that revolution, who were opposed to the previous regime, many of them have actually said and admitted that we didn't really understand what it was all about. Our objective was just to change things, but we didn't really know what we were going to get to. Well, guess what? By the time people realized what happened, it was too late. This time we say it's not going to be an unclear or non-transparent issue. Let people understand exactly what it is that is proposed, and on that basis, ultimately, by means of a national referendum, we'll see what the majority of the people will have. Which means that at the end of that process, a new system will be adopted, ratified by a referendum, which will lead us to the final phase of normalization, which means the election of the first parliament of this new democracy, and of course, the first elections of a democratic government, which will be the result of political parties organizing those elections, like we see everywhere in the world in democratic countries, and a government will be formed. And that's what I think will be the end result. So this journey takes us from where we are right now in terms of what can we do to force this regime to collapse, get into the process of transition and establishing the maximum participation possible of democratic forces, and ultimately leading into that solution. So we're relying ultimately on people's good sense, but also it's not just about freedom and democracy and all that. It's also a roadmap to recovery. And I think that's also very important to bring into the equation, which is why I'm not simply talking about political change in Iran. I'm also addressing the needs that the country will have in terms of how can we get out of this economic mess? How could we have jobs created? What kind of investment can we bring? How can we modernize our infrastructures? How can we bring in new technologies? And what's at stake in terms of opportunities for investment? I said earlier, it's not just a matter of national security for the US. Iran is one of the most untapped countries in terms of potential for investments, and we need that more than anything else. And I think this is where it can go hand in glove together, and that approach will be beneficial to all. It's just not for the sake of Iranians that I'm here talking to the media and the international community. I think you should take into consideration what it means for you and your interest as well. And it doesn't have to be zero-sum. It's not like back then where, perhaps a particular policy led to benefiting from something at the detriment of those nations. What I'm proposing is not going to be detrimental to one or the other. It's going to be win-win. It's going to be good for all. It is not the case right now, where we have a ruling paramilitary mafia that controls just about every aspect of the Iranian economy, doesn't allow for entrepreneurs in Iran to have a fair opportunity to thrive. Nobody wants to touch Iran under the current situation, and therefore, we need not be surprised about how dire the economic situation is in Iran. But imagine the opportunities that would be created. Imagine the kind of investment that could help us. Imagine if Elon Musk decides to put a plant of Tesla in Baluchistan tomorrow. And so many ideas like that. Imagine what kind of relationship we can have with key experts in the field of water management. Israelis have the best experts in the world, and how we can address the needs that Iran have in terms of managing our water crisis or our environmental issues. All of these are what could help our country redress itself beyond the fact that now we have freedom, that we have democracy, now we have human rights, but all those aspects as well.
So we talked a little bit about, how difficult it is to get independent reporting in Iran. So can you talk about, what is happening in Iran right now, and what do people not know that they should?
Well, I'm glad you emphasized that point, Mike, because I think one of the key issues that we have in Iran right now is how do we overcome censorship? How do we protect free speech? How can we let the Iranian people not be deprived of an opportunity to remain connected to the world? Part of our recommendation in terms of the maximum support to the Iranian people, a lot of it has to do with internet access. I think people, especially journalists in Iran, would know that the first bastion that the regime is trying to demolish is the ability for the Iranian people to have access to information and the access to the free propagation of such information. So a lot of what can be done in the area of countering the regime's attempt to suffocate to censor and to cut that link is the way to remedy that problem. Not remedy all the problems, but it's a great help. Because then, especially when we are talking about the mechanisms of access, which is mostly internet or social media, these are areas where we can, on the one hand, give more of a platform for dissidents or political prisoners or journalists in Iran to be heard and for the world to hear from them, but also to bring more support in identifying elements that the Iranian regime, and rest assured, are not sitting idle. They have their own cyber army, bot calls, trying to interfere and create havoc and discord among the opposition, many different tactics that are using to suppress not only opinion, but also to distort the fact. So it's not just about of independence and censorship, it's also factual reporting that is important to all of us. So that should be one of the key elements contemplated in how the free world can be of help. Rather than just having lip service and giving awards to courageous political activists or prisoners, let's actually give them the tools they need to balance the playing field and give them a better chance of success. And that is one of the items that is certainly extremely important and at the top of our list of asks from the free world and the international community to support.
I think this dovetails nicely, so I'll ask a question from in the room here. How confident are you that the people of Iran will support the change that you're fighting for?
Well, I think if you monitor statements that we hear from Iran, what people are saying when they are protesting or demonstrating, regardless of whatever sector of society they represent, from retirees to factory workers to government employees to nurses in hospitals. I mean, we have so many different indicators of ultimately people saying, basta, we've had it. We are seeing far more fragmentation within the regime. We are seeing that what we used to refer to as the gray strata, قشر خاکستری in Farsi, I think Iranians will understand exactly what I'm talking about. But we're seeing more and more disillusionment and defections. Because even if you were until recently in the mindset of reform and still thinking the traditional way reformists have been advocating, that slow change from within, this is no longer tenable. Even they don't believe that is a solution to the problem. So we are now engaged far more in dialogue and conversation with those who are now peeling away from the regime and are converging with those of us who from the very beginning were questioning the nature of this religious dictatorship that could not be a formula for the future. So the discourse now and the narrative has totally changed and is becoming much more in that direction. Every indication that we hear based on the reporting that we have from our own sources of whether it's the Iranian media or especially in social media are clearly demonstrating that trend. So I'm absolutely confident when I tell you that this is the current ask. The question is no longer whether this is what they want. The question they really have is how much support are we going to get? How much organization and structure and leadership should be provided? And part of it is on our shoulders as Iranians, but also how will the international community play a positive role in helping that process? And that's exactly the kind of discussions that is ongoing among ourselves as Iranians in the political activities that we have, together with people in Iranian civil society that are active inside the country, and of course the diaspora, but also our interaction, or let's call it diplomacy at the international level with respective countries and their governments as to where we can find a solution that will be helpful to us in terms of the foreign policy and the approach that they take. So the debate right now is more about how can we make that change happen rather than are we stuck with the regime and waiting for some miracle to come out of it, which I don't think people believe in that anymore.
Let me follow up on that with another question from the room. So what do you think should be done with those who were part of the Islamic regime or the IRGC, if the Islamic regime collapses?
You mean after?
Yeah, after.
That's also a very important element. Among other things that we are contemplating in terms of how the transition should occur and can occur, a lot of it is expertise work. Let me give you a tacit example. Truth and reconciliation was something important that happened as we saw change happen in South Africa. We have today dedicated lawyers and experts in the field of law and transitional justice that are looking exactly at the kind of issues that among them would be, how do we deal with the remnant of the regime? I begin by saying that at this time it is important to curtail the regime's use of its paramilitary militia, which is the IRGC, which is why I've been arguing, especially at the level of the European countries, that they should list the IRGC as a terrorist organization as part of their maximum pressure and sanctions. Why is this important? For two reasons. A, you cripple the regime and the IRGC that are doing the dirty work, but also you are encouraging more defections from the regime, in the mindset that part of our strategy is not just change of regime with the idea of revenge, but also keeping the idea of the importance of national reconciliation and amnesty for all those who don't have their hands soiled by the blood of the Iranian people. Which means that unlike what happened in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein and the de-Baathification, which pretty much sent most of those elements back to their homes, and guess what? Half of them ended up being hired as recruits for the ISIS forces. I don't want to see this happen in Iran. I want to make sure that those who know that they can survive regime change in Iran will not be hung by every tree in the streets of Iran. But those who have to be answerable for the crimes they have committed to the Iranian people will have to face justice, because the Iranian people cannot be denied that call for justice. But it has to be based on certain principles, certain methods. There's a science to it. There's models for it that have been successfully implemented in other countries. And in that sense, I don't think we should reinvent the wheel. We should simply use the best methods as to minimize conflict, maximize defections, offer opportunities down the line, keep those who are responsible accountable for the crimes they have committed, but allow for a national reconciliation. Because my whole objective here is to minimize the cost of change to the Iranian nation. Enough blood has been spilled. Enough sacrifices have been made. We don't have time for endless decades of revenge. We need to bring all of our assets to the ground. And as I said, and this has been my philosophy from the very beginning of addressing the alternative, I have reached out to the biggest opponents of my father, who were revolutionaries. Because I said, I don't care what you did then or what you thought then. What do you think now? And are you ready to join a coalition of the willing for a better Iran, having learned from our collective experiences? We don't have time for revenge. We need to be united with one voice. We should be free to have our opinions. We should be guaranteed our rights. No citizen of Iran should be, in any form or shape, be discriminated against for whatever reason there is. This is the guarantee of the law of the land. But the democratic culture of tolerance, of inclusion and diversity is not something that can be guaranteed by a printed document. We have to establish that culture. It's upon us to behave that way. And this is part of the real challenge here, because the rest is obvious. It's all upon us of what culture do we adapt. Do we seek reconciliation, or do we seek revenge? Do we seek justice in an equitable way, or are we going to have kangaroo trials and wanton executions as it happened early on as soon as Khomeini took over? In what way do we differ by our captives today? We cannot utilize or believe in the same methods. There has to be a contrast. And I think Iranians today understand that. I am very much in touch on a daily basis, particularly with Iran's Gen Z. And believe me, the Gen Z of today is far smarter, far more intelligent, and far more observant than any generation Iran has had before, including mine. And I'm very optimistic about their wisdom, their common sense, and the fact that they have resisted the temptation to be radicalized. They have resisted temptation to be provoked into violence and conflict. And in fact, they have adopted what I propose as a general method of struggle, which is nonviolent civil disobedience. Because I believe that if violence becomes a method to change, it will be not the result that everybody hoped to obtain. We have to be disciplined in that sense. So all of these are the kind of issues that we are discussing and looking at. So again, to summarize, part of creating the opportunity for maximum defection means simply one thing, that the Islamic regime is a sinking ship, and people are trying to now jump the boat. But they need to have terra firma at the other end. How do you expect, and I'm talking to the Iranian civilian population, how do you expect that the people with the arms, who should be an instrument of a shield for you against the regime, rather than the instrument of repression by the regime against you, come to your side if they don't feel that tomorrow you will accept them back into society, post this regime? Think about that. Think about that for a second. Are we going to achieve our goals by waging war and guerrilla warfare? Or we are going to minimize the guns that could be turned against us, as the regime will maybe try a last gasp attempt at some kind of a genocide at home? We should take that option off the table. And the only way we can take that option off the table for the regime is to tell them you have no leg to stand on anymore. Even those you thought you can depend on no longer want to be with you, and they want to join with the people. But a lot of it is up to us to accept them. And that doesn't mean that there won't be justice. That doesn't mean that those, as I said, who have their hands soiled with the blood of the Iranian people will not have to be accountable one day in court for crimes against humanity. But I think a great number of them who don't believe in the system anymore, who are not in that sense criminal, should be part of that process, should be part of that process that, as I said again, this is the alternative I propose. There might be some other scenarios. But this is, to me, the one that creates the path of least resistance, that maximizes the least costly way of bringing change, but most importantly, can give us the best chance to achieve a democratic outcome, as opposed to the replacement of one dictatorship with some other form. This is the last thing the Iranian people want. So for the Iranian people to have less fear for change, but also believe that change would be in the direction of what they want, we are left with not too many options in terms of scenarios of change. So I think that what I'm proposing offers them that change in every aspect of the issue.
Let me pivot for just a moment to an issue that I think is very important, especially for the club and our press freedom efforts. And then I'll come back to questions in the room here in just a second. So there are times when your supporters will launch cyber harassment campaigns against journalists whose coverage they disagree with. What is your message to those who engage in these online harassment campaigns against journalists, and do you condemn those actions?
Well, I have been for many years and on the record about this issue. Let me talk about three general principles. First of all, I think one of the elements that a lot of Iranians would relate to are principles that for centuries have been a part of the Iranian identity or psyche, which started with Zoroastrianism in Iran. We say pendare nik, goftare nik, kerdare nik, which means good thoughts, good deeds, and good words. That by itself goes back to the culture I was telling you about, a culture of respect, of tolerance, of accepting differences of opinion. And I've also said that we may completely disagree with one another, but disagreeing with someone doesn't make you or me each other's enemies. We can have a difference of opinion. But under the same roof and under equality and justice, we should be free to have our opinions. So let's respect each other's opinion, but defend the principles of that opinion, whether it's a journalist or writers or an activist or what have you. I have all the time and every time condemned any breach of those principles of harassment, foul language, insulting. I myself have been often faced with those kind of attacks and discrimination. But you have to keep focus and call people to be faithful to those principles and condemn those who behave in the wrong fashion. Some people might say, well, we cannot talk about censorship here because there's freedom of expression. I say, yeah, but not every expression is necessarily one that could be tolerated. For instance, if you profess racism, or if you profess, I don't know, a clear discrimination, or sexist gender-based attacks and these kind of things, which we often find in social media, unfortunately. This is the reality of the world in which we live. But I think the majority of Iranians do not pertain to some extremists who may be outside of this fold, but also understand that at the end of the day, that this third element that I wanted to add, do not discount the fact that the regime is using an entire campaign of cyber manipulation to, in fact, create those provocations, to pretend that so-and-so is representative of this group or that tendency, and play the role but be out there for the purposes of creating this kind of discord, to mess up, if you will, to muddy the waters. We have to be smart about this, to understand that these games are being played, but most importantly, starting by ourselves not falling victim to those games. If we observe all of these issues, that's the only way to contain it, to tackle with it, and deal with it.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions from the room here because they pertain to the same topic. So obviously you visited Israel in April of 2023. Can you talk a little bit about your view on the Israel-Hamas war, and then separately, what impact would a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine have, on the stability of the Iranian government?
I think a lot of what will create fundamental change for the better in the Middle East ultimately depends on what will happen in Iran. And, it's not because I'm Iranian that I talk about Iran all the time. The fact of the matter is that unless we, sorry, I broke your chair. The fact of the matter is that if we don't recognize that the eye of the octopus sits in Tehran, if you look at all these years, if you look at the fact that all the fires that has been lit regionally and beyond somehow ties back to the regime. And sure, you can have retaliation against proxies, and you have. But as long as the source of funding, training, equipping, and providing them with the means to propagate that kind of ideology, you will not have an element of stability in the Middle East. How could you expect a country like Israel to feel comfortable when it has an existential threat coming from Tehran that simply wants them wiped out from the map of the earth, knowing that it's funding its proxies that are constantly in conflict with them, a lot of them involving groups that are based, let's say in Gaza, like Hamas and what have you, to even contemplate the possibility of a legitimate solution to ultimately a viable Palestinian state. All of that rides on a fundamental change in Iran. Because I tell you, the first thing a free democratic Iran will seek is regional stability, cooperation, and cordial relationship with our neighbors. It is not based on an ideology that hates the Jews or is anti-Arabs or what have you. And in that prospect, when an element of stability is created, when the proxies are eliminated, when the funding of radicalism and extremism is gone, then you have a path to lasting, realistic peace. Until then, it is simply not attainable. And the cost is not just to the victims of terrorism, but countries who have been used and some societies that have been drawn into that conflict. And I'm sure that it's not just Iranians that are tired or Israelis that are tired, but I bet you there's so many Palestinians who are also tired. And I think the ultimate solution collectively goes back about changes coming in Iran. And Iran will be dedicated to bring about that element and work towards the possibility of this peace. That's why I think what elevating the Abraham Accords to the Cyrus Accord is so critical. Because without Iran in that scenario, the Abraham Accords by itself and its current members is not sufficient to get the job done. You need to have Iran play a crucial role in that, which is why it's so important for Iran to have a political change, as I said, not just for Iranians in the region, but for the whole world. If the expectation is, do we finally have a legitimate peace and an ultimate solution for the Palestinians as well, not just the Israelis?
Given the scale of repression in Iran, how can the movement for freedom and change really gain momentum in the country?
I think that when you look at several campaigns that have occurred in the past, let's say at least 2 decades, the first most significant one perhaps was the Green Movement at the time of the Obama administration, of course, the Green Movement and what was happening within Iran, which was one of the opportunities that could have had some impact, although I think, let's not forget that even in that case, it was still within the context of reform to the regime rather than change of regime. But be it as it may, a lot of people came to the streets back then. Mahsa Amini was murdered. The Mahsa revolution was certainly one in the last 2-3 years that was quite significant. And by the way, I'm sure you might have noticed that the frequency of repeated campaigns of resistance or uprising in Iran have become far more frequent with lesser separation in time than the 3 decades before. That shows you the dynamics and the ask and the want that the Iranian people have. But I was saying earlier, unfortunately, nothing was truly done to help them get more momentum by equaling the playing field for them. That's why maximum support is very important. Because maximum pressure and sanction by themselves is not enough to get the job done. Look, when you look at successive examples that I could use, and a lot of it perhaps, which is closest to the scenario of change, 2 things led to the liberation of Europe and all those countries that were stuck under the umbrella of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. One was, of course, the general strategy that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had dealing with the Soviets and Mikhail Gorbachev, and ultimately what led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. But if you look at the way the supported movements, such as Solidarity in Poland, the way dissidents in those Eastern European countries felt supported as opposed to ignored or abandoned or thrown under the bus. These are the kind of elements that teaches us all, in modern history at least, that there is an element of foreign support that comes into play. How do you incentivize democratic sitting countries? How can you give them the actual means and tools to access? We were just talking about just one aspect of it, which is censorship and free information and access to the internet. These are actual means that are important and can change the whole dynamics and opportunities for change in a realistic way. We don't need to have UN resolutions or condemnation, a sympathy for human rights abuse in Iran, and sort of symbolic gesture by Hollywood actresses or French parliamentarians, cutting their hair, or the hijab thing, as if this was the only ask the people of Iran have. If you really mean what you say, if you really intend to help freedom for a nation that deserves it, then put your money where your mouth is. Take the actual steps. So when I talk to an Iranian dissident inside Iran, when I talk to the political prisoner who is on furlough, and when I ask him or her what it is that is missing here, 2 things is the most frequent answer that I get. Number 1, we need stronger leadership at home. You need to start it outside because it's hard for us to do it inside right now. So we have to work with one another inside and outside to get that done. That's within the Iranian spectrum. And number 2, we don't see actual support from the outside world. We see governments that are willing to pay ransom to free hostages, but instead of helping us, they're funding the regime that has access to hundreds of billions of dollars that they shouldn't have had, for instance, if the oil sanctions were actually implemented. And guess what? It wasn't spent on Iran and Iranians. It was spent on financing proxies, perhaps a cause that incentivized the regime to go to the extreme where we should not be surprised that something that October 7th happened as a result. These are the kind of legitimate questions and challenges. When I talk to foreign policymakers, when I ask the question, what should our foreign policy be, that's precisely the areas where you can make the difference. Make people believe that you mean what you say, that you actually stand with freedom-seeking nations. And you have had before. It's not like it's the first time we're asking any country to do that. You've done it before, successfully. I wonder what the ANC and Nelson Mandela would be able to tell you of how they were incentivized in getting to where they were, and how the government in Pretoria understood that they can no longer sustain apartheid in South Africa, or what it took to put an end to the Soviet Union, and how important it was, a coordinated effort in the Western free world. Well, I think that the change in Iran is not far apart in that sense of incentivizing dissident, activists, journalists, lawyers, workers, because, look, a different Iran would mean that people who actually can get the job done, that are not involved in the corruption of this regime, that are not part of this social injustice and economic divide that is the direct impact of this regime. And as a result, 60% of Iranian people live under the poverty line. This is a country where a lot of its technocrats and bureaucrats want to be part of the solution. They're looking for an opportunity to serve. They're looking for an opportunity to lead the country. We have tremendous amount of natural resources in Iran and potential for having the right minds, bright minds, lead our country. But they cannot do it under the circumstances. That's why it's so important to help them liberate themselves from this regime. And that's why we need far more, as I said, than just lip service. This is the time to engage in a realistic way with the alternative forces, with the Iranian democratic opposition, with activists at home. Help them, support them. Whether it means technical support, technological support, financial support. And again, I said, not by your taxpayers' money, but to liberate the kind of funds that is the Iranian people's money in the first place, and put that back into the game so they have a better chance of success. It's all about maximizing success. And a lot of it, at the end of the day, is a matter of resources and means. And this is something that would be a realistic way of addressing the issue. And that's the actual expectation right now on the streets. People are fighting with almost nothing in their hand. They need to have more, and this is why the foreign policy of these governments should understand that as you tweak and address additional sanctions in the context of bringing pressure on the regime, there's a lot more that needs to be done in the area of maximum support for the people. This is the biggest challenge that I think we face as the opposition, but we'd like to work with our counterparts with the free world in what ways they can help us in that and bring about the kind of help that we actually need to make the campaign of liberation in Iran successful and ultimately victorious.
So before I ask the final question here, because we're closing in on time, let me just take a moment to thank Headliners team leader Jen Judson, National Press Club Program Manager Cecily Scott Martin, Club Executive Director Didier Saji, and National Press Club member Sehun Kim. And finally, thank you to our audience. We hope you'll join us on February 21st when we host a conversation with DC Mayor Muriel Bowser about the future of this city. It is also my honor to present our guest with the coveted National Press Club mug before we get to our final question here. Why don't we just swing into that final question? So you've talked about this a little bit, but maybe you can expand. So we've been hearing a lot about the possibility of new negotiations with Iran, primarily focused on nuclear issues. Have you been in touch with the Trump administration directly? And do you have any insight into the current status of those negotiations? What message would you like to convey directly to the Trump administration?
Well, my team has had some contact with the transition team of President Trump's second term administration. There was no specific necessary discussion on the nuclear issue or the nuclear aspect. But one thing that I can say right off the bat is, look, what happened under JCPOA, or the expectation of what will ultimately resolve the problem, is a very hard element to actually guarantee its enforcement or implementation, because the non-transparency of the regime all these years has led many entities, including the IAEA, to realize that limited access, not knowing exactly what they are doing in terms of enrichment and what have you, is something that will never feel or give you that satisfaction or certitude that they are in fact abiding by what it is that they're doing. And by the way, let's even assume for a second that there is a nuclear deal. Will that resolve the entire problem? Will that take away the rest of the elements or the impact, negative impact, I might add, that the regime has in regional instability? In fact, it was after the first JCPOA that the regime was incentivized, and they took 10 sailors on one of the American military ship in the Persian Gulf hostage. So are they going to change their behavior in general, even under a nuclear deal? These are the kind of questions that should make us think twice about, is that at the end of the day the only problem you have? No, the problem is multiple when you come to the regime. The funding of proxies will continue, regional stability will continue, interference in the affairs of other countries will continue, radicalization will continue. None of that will change. Again, as I said, it's in the DNA of the regime. Its DNA hasn't changed for 45 years. We should not expect it will change in the next 45 years. The problem is we don't have another 45 years to wait. The Iranian people are tired of that. And you can resolve the problem not by thinking that this time the regime will come clean, but understand that the alternative, the Iranian people are not warmongers. They want to be peacemakers. The Iranian people do not want to have any kind of military conflict in the region. The Iranian people need not talk about defense and in the sense of being a right which the regime was trying to advocate as they were encouraging the militarization of the nuclear program in Iran. Energy هسته‌ای حق مسلم ماست, those of you understand, but what was behind it? What was the thinking behind it? Why would you enrich heavy water reactors? Well, heavy water is not for nuclear energy. It's intent for ultimately enriching. Anyway, I don't want to belabor the question. The fact is that the best guarantee of putting an end to the problem is not going to come by cutting a deal with this regime. It's by helping the Iranian people free themselves, because they will be the first guarantee that you don't have to worry about Iran anymore, because we will be there as peacemakers and playing the game of stability by means of regional partnership and relationship and mutual respect. That is the ultimate guarantee and the ultimate solution. So don't waste too much time building hope yet again in some games that the regime might play, trying to lead you to believe, as I said in my opening remarks, they will lose every subterfuge and every trick in the book to try to fool you yet again. But as the saying goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Thank you so much. Let's give a warm round of applause. Thank you for being here at the National Press Club, and we stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.